Joined now in Studio 3 by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former editor of the Miami Herald, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, Martin Baron. His career in journalism spans some incredible moments in American history. In 2000 at the Miami Herald during the presidential recount, of course, the Elian Gonzalez saga. A few years later as editor of the Boston Globe, exposing the clergy sex abuse scandal, and most recently as editor of the Washington Post under owner Jeff Bezos during the administration of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who, as a reminder, when he is not testifying in a civil fraud case, frequently says things like this.
The media, those people right there, they're corrupt, largely corrupt. They are truly the enemy of the people. They are.
They are, he says. That's from a rally last year in Pennsylvania. Baron tells the story of leading the storied newspaper in his new book. It's terrific. Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Marty, it's good to see you, and congratulations.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
But you get to sit next to that guy at dinner, and I guess he poked you.
Yeah, he was poking me with his left elbow while he was talking to Jeff Bezos across the table, and I was very tempted to poke him with my right elbow right back again. But
wait a second, we were going to get to this, but since Margery did it, tell the story. It's at the beginning of the book. It is unbelievable. It's you, Bezos, a couple of big shots of the Washington Post in addition to you guys.
Yeah, the publisher, Fred Ryan, and then the editor of the editorial page, Fred Hyatt. Melania was there, and Jared Kushner.
She
and
shops a lot at Amazon. I don't know if you know that.
She said she really liked to shop at Amazon, and Bezos offered to be her personal customer representative.
And we want to be clear, the elbow thing you just described was real. This really, he is...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. We were at this dinner. I was very wary of this dinner, by the way, because Trump is so transactional, and if he provided a dinner, I was sure that he was going to expect something in return. Mm-hmm. So... And also, Bezos was coming, and I was worried about the suggestion that Bezos somehow had a hand in our news coverage, which he did not. But the entire dinner, Bezos pretty much did all the talking, but he was talking directly to Jeff Bezos.
Wait a minute. Trump did all the talking.
I'm sorry, Trump did, excuse me.
That's okay.
Trump did all the talking at Bezos. And every time he would criticize the Post, which was frequent, he would elbow me. I was to his left, and he would elbow me, and I was very tempted to elbow him right back. But you don't do that to the President of the United States.
Well, I did get off track there, but I'm going to ask you why he wrote the book. But before I read, he did expect something in return. Basically, he thought you were going to go light on him after this dinner.
Well, that was the purpose. Clearly, it was made clear to him at the beginning, him and his aides, that this would just be a get-to-know-you kind of session. But as I suspected, he expected something out of this, and he did call Bezos the very next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning on his cell phone and asked him if he could do something to make the Post, as he put it, more fair to him. And he said, I don't know whether you get involved in news coverage, but I'm sure you do. So on the one hand saying, I don't know if you get involved, but I'm sure you do. Somehow that the way that Trump speaks. And then Bezos said, I don't get involved in news coverage, and if I did, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And then at the end of the conversation, Trump said, well, if there's anything that you ever need, basically an invitation for Bezos to ask for a favor, which thankfully he did not do.
Well, my original question was supposed to be, why did you write this book, Martin Baron? So why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it because I was living in the middle of history, really important history for the Post, of course, important history for the press, important history for the country. Here we had a situation where the family that had owned the Washington Post for 80 years, the Graham family, decided to sell because of all the pressures on our industry. They had run dry on ideas on how to turn things around and make us a sustainable business. They sold it to one of the richest people in the world, and he then set out to transform the Post into a media organization for the digital era and make it national and even international. And then along comes Donald Trump in the summer of 2015 as a presidential candidate unlike any we'd ever seen before, and then a president unlike any we'd ever seen before. And I thought that's a pretty amazing story and an important story about the role of the press in this democracy at a time when democracy was being threatened by the Trump presidency. And, the motto of the Post is democracy dies in darkness. I thought I'd shed a little light on our role in democracy.
So Bezos, I think it was 7 months in, he into your editorship, if that's a word, he buys the paper. How anxious were you? How nervous were you about having Bezos as a boss?
I was nervous. I mean, we had just published the documents that had been leaked by Edward Snowden. These were the most classified documents in the U.S. government, highly sensitive national security documents. Amazon had a big business, the cloud computing business. They had a big contract with the CIA, so I was concerned about that, as well as all of his other commercial interests. And of course, he had no real history with the media. In fact, Amazon generally said no comment whenever the media would call. So I had no.
Wasn't he asked that in a town hall that he did at the newspaper
He
by
did
one of
it-
your?
Well, at the first town hall, he was asked about that.
Yeah.
Somebody said, "Well, you always say no comment," and his response was, "Well, you have the right to ask the question, and they have the right not to answer the question." He compartmentalizes things like that very well.
My impression, though, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you called him a guy with integrity and spine and witty and self-deprecating, and that he came in and really had some good suggestions for the transition of the Post. So talk a little bit about you liked him, it seemed to me.
Yeah, I did. I mean, over time. I mean, I didn't know how witty and self-deprecating he was until well into his ownership of the Post. But he did have ideas for transforming the organization. He immediately said that our business model needed to change. We had been a newspaper really for the Washington metro region, even though we covered national politics and all of that. And he said that was good for a previous era, but we needed to become national and international, and we had a unique opportunity to do so because we were in the nation's capital, a good base. We had the name the Washington Post, which could be leveraged to a national and even international level, and we had a history and a heritage going back to Watergate, where people they felt they knew the Washington Post, maybe from the movie All the President's Men or things like that. This was an investigative-oriented news organization, one that held power to account. And now we had the opportunity to deliver our news without delivering a physical newspaper. We had what he called the gift of the internet. We didn't think of the internet as much of a gift at the time, but he said, this is the gift, and you should take it.
So speaking of business models, we're talking to Marty Baron, former editor of the Washington Post and the Globe. His book is Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Speaking of business model, so you have a billionaire owner who you write repeatedly kept his hands out of your business. Your former paper has a billionaire owner, John Henry. Then there's that Rupert Murdoch guy. How do you feel about newspapers being rescued, for lack of a better verb, by billionaires? Is that something you're comfortable with?
I'm comfortable if the billionaire behaves appropriately with regard to the journalism. I think we should really be focused more on what is the journalism that these news organizations are practicing rather than what's the ownership model. There are problems with every ownership model, problems and advantages. I mean, we complained when these were public companies. We said they were maximizing profit. Mm-hmm. You know, news organizations were making 40 to 50% profits every year, and they were returning that to their shareholders and not really adequately investing in our future, as we can see today. And then now we see private equity firms and hedge funds buying newspapers, and they're treating them like annuities and extracting every last dollar in cash out of them. And even nonprofits that, they're dependent, nonprofit news organizations are dependent on foundations and wealthy people. They have their own agendas too. They have something that they would like those news organizations to pursue. And then, of course, billionaires have their own commercial interests. But the question is, what is the journalism that's being practiced? So I think we should focus more on that as opposed to what is the ownership model.
Well, you talk a lot about journalism. As former newspaper reporter, I loved all this stuff about, I mentioned his thinking that editors didn't matter that much, even though every reporter knows your life depends on a great editor. You always want to have someone that make it look better, or someone with great ideas and stuff like that. But to me, things changed a lot when Donald Trump was running for office and then when he became the president. But you talk about in 2016 going after Hillary Clinton and the private server and the emails and Donald Trump's repeated outrageous things he said, about John McCain, prefer prisoners that don't get caught and all that kind of stuff. Talk about that equivalency thing, that false equivalency thing that journalism has struggled with all through Trump's presidency.
Yeah, and I don't think that we practice false equivalence at the Post, but I mean, clearly, initially, Hillary Clinton was the lead candidate for the Democratic nomination, and initially, people didn't think that Trump would win the nomination. So we were very much focused on Hillary Clinton, and there was a lot to investigate with regard to her. And then it emerged. There were two really email stories that emerged during our campaign. One was that she kept a lot of her emails on her private server, and the other was the Russian hack of the Democratic National Committee servers, where her emails and a lot of emails of her colleagues within the Democratic Party, particularly the leadership of the Democratic Party, suggested that the DNC was favoring her campaign over that of Bernie Sanders. There was a lot to cover there. I would say that with regard to that second email story, the hack, we needed to cover the content of those emails, and certainly Bernie Sanders and his partisans were very focused on that. They weren't focused on the provenance of those emails, but we and the press probably should have focused even more on Russia's role and why Russia was hacking those emails. And I think we needed a little bit better balance between those two issues. One of the problems at the time was that the intelligence community simply was not willing to say that Russia was responsible for it.
Yeah.
And they even dismissed the idea that even if Russia was responsible for it, they weren't so sure that it was such a big deal. They changed their tune later on and not only suggested, but concluded that Russia hacked these emails in order to help the campaign of Donald Trump. So there was that. I mean, as far as Trump himself, look, he was a candidate unlike any candidate we'd ever seen before. He, virtually every statement contained a falsehood or a lie or something like that. And we never saw anything like that before. He was willing to attack his enemies and to, in a way that we had not seen before.
Was the hush money issue when you first used the word lie in the newspaper? Was it the hush money thing? When did you finally decide to say it's okay to say in the pages of the Washington Post that he is lying about whatever
that was when he finally testified that he really did draft. There was this incident where the Russians were invited to go to Trump Tower to meet with Jared Kushner and Don Jr. and all of those people, where they said they had dirt on Hillary Clinton. Trump actually drafted the statement for that. He denied initially when we reported that he did draft the statement about that, misrepresenting what that meeting was all about. He denied that. He later had to testify that, in fact, he did draft that statement, and that was a clear lie. He knew that he drafted the statement, obviously, and then, but he didn't tell the truth about that.
You decided it was okay as editor of the Washington Post to eventually call it what it was, a lie, when you had the evidence that it was a lie, as opposed to his usual delusional self. You were called by a former editor, I'm not sure, but a former higher up in the country, urging you to cover the issue of whether or not Donald Trump was mentally ill. And we talked about it a lot on the show. I am not subject to the Goldwater rule, nor am I subject to the level of responsibility, I guess because I'm an opinion journalist of sorts, than you were as editor of the paper. You resisted doing that. Could you explain why?
Sure. Yeah. It was really actually the person who was really pushing that was George Conway.
That was in the Atlantic. He wrote that piece in the Atlantic.
He wrote a big piece
right?
in the Atlantic
Right.
arguing that, and there were other people who were arguing for that as well, including people internally within our news organization. Look, I think it's very hard we haven't diagnosed him. There weren't any psychiatrists that actually had diagnosed him. People were supposedly diagnosing him from a distance and coming to some conclusions that he was mentally ill. No question he's narcissistic. That's just not a question. But as to whether that constitutes mental illness, that's an actual medical diagnosis. And I was unwilling to go there because I can't get into his head. What I can do is show if he's doing crazy things, we should report on the crazy things. I can't necessarily say, I know that we're not supposed to use the word crazy these days, but I can't say that he's mentally ill.
We're talking with Marty Baron. The new book is Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. You also presided, maybe it started when you were at the Globe, I'm not sure, but certainly by the time you were at the Washington Post, suddenly reporters that usually spent their days, out reporting the stories or in the office writing them were on CNN, MSNBC, everybody's tweeting to beat the band. You had a difficult time because people in their tweets were often expressing opinions and they were reporters. So talk about that.
Sure. I had a lot of concern about the social media activity of people on the staff. Look, when you have the name the Washington Post on the building, that represents something. That means it represents the standards that have been established over a long period of time about how we go about our journalism, how we practice journalism. And we do that with reporters and editors working together on that, and particularly on the most sensitive stories, working collectively and collaboratively on how we approach those stories. Well, what happens when anybody on the staff can say whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, on any subject, whether they know anything about it or don't know anything about it, and it torpedoes those standards and it undermines the reputation of the institution, the very reputation that was built because of the standards that we had practiced over decades.
But one of the people, the two people in question that I'm sure most people listening have heard of, obviously Wes Lowery, was a brilliant, really young reporter at the Boston Globe, was with us quite frequently. And I think this all arose post his travails in Ferguson after the killing of Michael Brown, and Felicia Summers, who had been a sexual abuse survivor and then was tweeting about sexual abuse, particularly about Kobe Bryant. I think it was on the day he died or the day after he died. I think part of what Lowery's response to the Post and Marty Baron's position was, correct me if I'm wrong, Marty Baron, is he wasn't tweeting opinion, he was tweeting fact about racism in this country. How did you, if I'm right about that, how did you respond to that?
Well, I'm not exactly sure that's his opinion. He can speak for himself. But it was pretty clearly opinion. In fact, he's subsequently said that one of his tweets was glib, is the word that he himself used, and it wasn't something that he would have put into the Washington Post. And so I don't think people should be tweeting out. Glib means shallow, by the way.
Thank you for that.
And I don't think that's the sort of thing that should be tweeted out. And those were opinions. Clearly, they were opinions.
So, is there a difference between the reporter who's covering a beat and the columnist who's paid for their opinion in terms of tweeting?
Well, a columnist is different. A columnist is an opinion person,
Okay.
and that's their job, is to express an opinion. The people in the news department, which generally is separated from the opinion department, their job is to cover the news. So, if somebody in the news department wants to express an opinion, they're certainly free to apply for a job in the opinion department.
Speaking of racism and Wes Lowery, we had him on a couple of times.
Many
He was
times,
really,
yeah, we did.
Anyway, you talked about congratulating the staff after the Black Lives Matter protest, but also admitting that you didn't really feel the pain at the time of the black journalists who watched George Floyd get murdered. Talk about that.
Yeah, sure. And by the way, I think Wes is a very talented journalist. I make that very clear in the book, and I continue to believe that very firmly. He's done tremendous work that brought great honor to himself and to the Post.
It was very annoying to him, to a lot of us, how quickly he succeeded. What was he, 23?
23.
Winning all these awards.
I'm not annoyed by that. I had something to do with that.
I'm sure you weren't annoyed.
I hired him to the Washington Post, and was very glad that he joined our
very,
staff,
very
and
talented.
actually not happy that he left. So. But look, at the time of George Floyd, that had an impact on black journalists in a way that we had not seen before with previous incidents. It's not as if that was the first killing by police of a black citizen, and so. But this had an impact beyond that, and I was not really attuned to that. I did congratulate the staff on our coverage of that amid the pandemic and covering all of the other things that we had to cover, but I did not express. I didn't mention the pain that black journalists were feeling even as they were covering all of this, and so people felt. I understand now that this was a serious omission on my part. And it was emblematic of the fact that we didn't have sufficient diversity in the newsroom leadership, which we did not. And so
you thought about stepping aside briefly, didn't you?
Well, yeah. There was an uprising actually in the staff over what was deemed to be insufficient diversity in the leadership of the organization, and I had also, in my effort to respond to that, at a sort of a town hall meeting afterwards. I was tone deaf in my response. I did not handle it well. I really regret it. It's my biggest regret. And so, if I had to do it over again, I'd do things very differently. But as I acknowledge in the book, quite openly, I did not handle that well, and I do regret that very much so.
And you, by expressing that, I'm sure that's hard to do, and I admire you for having been candid about that. But you were not very, you don't write much about yourself. I mean, maybe if I were to say to you, can you spend 15 seconds describing everything you told us about yourself in the book, you wouldn't need 15 seconds, right? What?
Well, I could probably fill 15 seconds.
Well, maybe.
For you, but,
I don't think you could get to
more
30.
More than you give me credit for.
Why'd you make? I mean, I have to say, as a consumer, well, I know you slightly, obviously, from your time here and from consuming your work from afar. I'm really interested in what made you as good as you were perceived to be. I mean, most people write, you're the most important editor of a generation. Why don't you feel it was important? Why didn't you feel it was important to share with us some of what got you to be who you are and what you were?
I thought I'd write an interesting book.
It is an interesting book. It's a very interesting book.
I'm not sure that if I focused on myself that it would be all that interesting, frankly. I focused on my role in public life, and I think that's what's relevant here is my role, whether it was at the Boston Globe or the Washington Post or the Miami Herald. That's what I think is relevant. And I do have, certain personal details in there, but they are the details that are relevant to my role as an editor of major media institutions.
You were born in Florida. Do you know that?
You do know that? I don't remember the exact moment that happened, but I've been told that that's exactly what happened.
Yes. When I saw you do an interview, and I can't remember how I saw it, about the book, and where you were talking about, obviously, the obvious history that everybody listening knows about the Washington Post pre-you bringing down a president, Richard Nixon. Your wonderful work at the Boston Globe brought down a cardinal, even though I wish he had been brought down more. Do you... Now that you're you're not really retired, you just wrote a book, but whatever you are in your post-Washington Post life, do you say to yourself that as great as your reporters did, and I think they did, covering Trump, a guy who, at least in my opinion, I assume you would agree, is far more dangerous in general and to the future of democracy than Richard Nixon could ever dream about being, wasn't brought down. What do you say to yourself about that, if anything?
Look, our job in the news business is to give the public, the citizens of this country and others, the information they need and deserve to know in order to govern themselves. Ultimately, they govern themselves. They make those kinds of decisions. Look, what happened in 2018 is that the Republicans lost the House.
That's true.
In 2020, they lost the presidency. And they also lost the Senate in a special election in Georgia. They made those decisions based on what they knew about Donald Trump as a politician and as a person. They will have that choice again in 2024. I don't know what they're going to decide to do. That is up to them. The public, the American citizens decide what kind of government they wish to have. Our job in the news business is to give them the information they need and deserve to have to govern themselves.
How much you worry as a citizen about the decision they're going to make in 2024? You obviously saw, we talked at the top of the show about the New York Times poll in the 5 swing states. This is a guy who a court in New York determined had sexually abused E. Jean Carroll, not to mention another couple of dozen, we believe, credible accusations of sexually inappropriate behavior. While not formally accused of insurrection, is essentially accused of being an insurrectionist president, and more in criminal terms. And a plurality of the American people, as of today, a year out, seem to think that he's the appropriate person to lead us for 4 more years. What does that say about our citizenry, about this country in 2023, Marty Baron?
Well, obviously, there are concerns about Joe Biden. There are concerns about the economy. There are concerns about the wars that we're involved in. So the public has a wide range of concerns. There are concerns about age, even though they both have age issues. But look, I mean, and I think our role in the press is to make clear what's at stake here in this election. Clearly, I mean, this is not a matter of opinion. This is matter of fact. Is that the kinds of things that Trump has been talking about doing in another term are authoritarian in nature. Okay, so he's the only person I've heard talk about suspending the Constitution of the United States. He has talked about using the military under the rubric of the Insurrection Act to suppress totally legitimate protests in this country. He's talked about bringing treason charges against what was then the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and most likely executing him. He's talked about bringing treason charges against NBC simply because they don't have stories that are favorable to him. every one of these things qualifies as authoritarian in nature. There's just no question about it. So there's a lot at stake in this election.
So this, compared to that, is a superficial question, but I'm a superficial person, so I'll ask you anyway. You have a great little part in there where you go out to Bezos' house and Mackenzie, they're still married then, and she's cooking the pancakes for you and the 4 kids. I mean, not everybody gets to go in Jeff Bezos' house and watch his wife cook pancakes. What was that like?
It was fun. They were very gracious hosts. They were really terrific.
The house?
They had the house was nice. I only saw a portion of it, of course. I did see the boathouse, and that was substantial. But
really, what was the boat in the boathouse?
I didn't see the boat, so we just did business in there in a sort of a conference room area. And but look, I mean, they were very gracious. He invited us to breakfast. Mackenzie and he and their kids, were making breakfast, and they made pancakes, and it's why a select group of us, the 4 of us who were there, were named the Pancakes Group. So that's what our nickname was, essentially.
And she put the kibosh on the original. You have "Democracy Dies in Darkness" now as the motto of the Washington Post, but she put the kibosh on the previous one,
which was horrible. What was that?
Yeah.
What was that? One?
I'm having a hard time remembering. I think I blocked it from my memory exactly. But it was we had come up with it, and after we had worked on this for 2 years. And then we met at the Ritz-Carlton in Georgetown, and we said we have a half hour to decide this, and we didn't come up with it. Finally, of the 6 I think it was about a half dozen options, none of them satisfied us. We came up with something else. Bezos then flew home, and he sent us an email that evening saying that this is not the news you want to hear. But Mackenzie, my in-house wordsmith,
I love that.
who is a novelist, she's a novelist. She pronounced it Frankenslogan. So that was the end of that particular one.
I thought that was great.
And that's when Bezos essentially said, "Well, why don't we use Democracy Dies in Darkness," which is something that Bob Woodward had been using a lot.
And this is not about Trump and Bezos, but since you are in Boston, and we frequently talk about what the Catholic Church has still not done to rectify the abuse against children and teenagers for all those years, and not being forthcoming about the priests and the bishops, etc. You came up with the idea that when your reporters came to you and talked about there being a number of priests that were accused, you said, no, we got to go after the whole shebang, the church. How did you make that decision?
Well, it was true that we had evidence that there were a large number of priests who had abused kids, and we could have gone with a story like that. But I was concerned. Look, it's not the first time that we've known that priests have abused kids. So I was concerned that in itself would just look sensationalist. It's just a numbers matter, and that the real question there wasn't really being addressed. That we didn't have an answer yet, which was, well, what did the church do when it knew about this? And what was its response? It had a duty to take care of these children. And did it do that? Was it aware of this abuse, and then it reassigned these priests from parish to parish without telling anybody, not the parishioners, not the public, nobody. And so there was a bigger story that needed to be done, and that was the more important story. It was the issue of institutional culpability and an institutional cover-up. And that's the story that I was pushing for us to get, and that's why I felt we should hold off and do that bigger story.
Now, there was a scene in Spotlight where you went into Cardinal Loth's office and met him. Did that actually happen? And if so, what'd you think?
Yeah, well, I actually called at the office and somebody corrected me, said residence, by the way. Well, we met. He was fine. He was nice.
He was?
He wasn't hostile to me. I had just arrived in Boston at that point, and I was getting around and meeting everybody I could. And I was very late for that meeting because I got lost on the streets of Boston, and I was about
you got lost on Commonwealth Avenue.
I didn't know where I was. Frankly, I was very confused. And my assistant at the time was using MapQuest, and it could send you. Remember MapQuest?
Yes, I do.
And it could send you into really strange territory. And I got there an hour late. But he was, he talked a lot about. He obviously had done the research and knew that I was Jewish. He talked a lot about Israel, which was not a subject that I was expecting to be talking about. And then as I walked out, he pulled off the shelf the Catechism of the Catholic Church and said, "This is what we believe." And there was a clear we kind of set up there. And it's like, well, you're not one of us, but this is what we believe. So
okay.
I thought it was strange. there was a little creative license in the movie where they had it wrapped in
Yes.
wrapping with a cross
Yes.
on it. He just gave me the book, so that was creative license.
And you went right home and studied it, I'm sure.
I actually, believe it or not, I actually
did?
felt that I probably should read this because here I am in a city that is predominantly Catholic or heavily Catholic. And I read about 12 pages, and then I was like, I don't have time. This is going to take me the entirety of my time in Boston, and I need to read other things. So I stopped.
Marty Baron, the book is great. Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. It's great to see you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We
Thanks
really
for having me.
Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate
terrific.
it, and congratulations. It's really it's a page turner.
Oh,
Marty
great.
Baron.
Thank you very much.
It's a lot of
Appreciate it.
pages, but you can page them. You can turn them. You can turn them pretty quickly.
You're saying I should have been more concise. Is that
No,
what you're
no.
saying? I
Hey,
see.
listen,
Okay.
I'm a former reporter. I was eating it up, believe
Yeah.
me. We've been speaking to Pulitzer Prize, but you don't have to be a reporter. You can be anybody. You're not a reporter, Jim.
I don't think I am, no.
No, we've been speaking to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former editor of the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, Marty Baron. The new book, which you should really pick up, is Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Lots of inside dope, too, about sitting next to both Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump. Okay.